Chapter 5. The trio journeyed on, the pattern of the next few days being very much the same, free of incident or excitement. Leaving their resting place at daylight, they would jog steadily along by day, their pace determined mainly by the endurance of the old dog. Their favorite sleeping places were hollows under uprooted trees, where they were sheltered from the wind and able to burrow down among the drifted leaves for warmth. At first there were frequent halts and rests, but daily the terrier became stronger. After a week he was lean, but the scars on his shoulders were healing, and his coat was smooth and healthy. In fact, he was in better condition and looked younger and fitter than at the onset of the journey. He had always had a happy disposition, and most of the time looked perfectly content, trotting along through the vast stillness of the bush with stolid, unaltered good humor. He was almost always hungry, but that skilful hunter, the cat, kept him provided with food, which, while scarcely ever satisfying, was adequate by his new standard of living. It was only the famished young dog who really suffered, for he was not a natural hunter, and wasted a lot of ill-afforded energy in pursuit. He lived mainly on frogs, mice, and the occasional leavings of the other two. Sometimes he was lucky enough to frighten some small animal away from its prey, but it was very inadequate diet for such a large and heavily built dog, and his ribs were beginning to show through the shining coat. He was unable to relax, his constant hunger driving him to forage even when the other two were resting, and he never joined them in their amiable foolery, when sometimes the cat would skitter away in pretended fear from the growling, wagging white dog, often ending in being chased up a tree. Then the Labrador would sit apart, aloof and watchful, nervous and tense. It seemed as though he were never able to forget his ultimate purpose and goal. He was going home. Home to his own master. Home where he belonged, and nothing else mattered. This lodestone of longing, this certainty, drew him to lead his companions ever westward through wild and unknown country, as unerringly as a carrier pigeon released from an alien loft. Nomadic life seemed to agree with the cat. He was in fine fettle, sleek and well-groomed, and as debonair as ever, and had adapted himself so well that at times it appeared as though he were positively enjoying the whole expedition. Sometimes he left the other two for an hour or so at a time, but they had ceased to pay any attention to his absence now, and sooner or later he always reappeared. They traveled mostly in old abandoned trails, astonishingly plentiful in this virtually uninhabited region. Occasionally they cut straight through the bush. It was fortunate that the Indian summer weather still continued, for the short, thin coat of the bull terrier could not stand low temperatures, and although a thicker undercoat was already growing in on to compensate, it would never be adequate. The cat's coat, too, was thickening, making him appear heavier. The Labrador's needed no reinforcement, and was already adapted to all extremes, the flat, thick hairs so close together that they made an almost waterproof surface. The short days were warm and pleasant, when the sun was high, but the nights were cold. One night, when there was a sudden sharp frost, the old dog shivered so much that they left the shallow cave of their resting place soon after the bright, ringed moon rose, and traveled through the remainder of the night, resting most of the following morning in the warmth of the sun. The leaves were losing their color rapidly, and many of the trees were nearly bare, but the dogwood and the pigeonberry on the sides of the trail still blazed with color, and the Michaelman's daisies and fireweed flourished. Many of the birds of the forest had already migrated. Those that were left gathered into great flocks, filling the air with their restless chatter as they milled around, and the long, drawn-out streamers suddenly wheeling to form a clamorous cloud, lifting and falling in indecision. They saw few other animals. The noisy progress of the dogs warned the shy natural inhabitants long before their approach, and those they did meet were too busy and concerned with their winter preparations to show much curiosity. The only other bear that they encountered was sleek and fat as butter, complacent and sleepy, his thoughts obviously already running on hibernation, and quite uninterested in the strange animals. He was, in fact, sitting on a log in the sun when the animals saw him. After giving them a sleepy inspection from his little deep-set eyes, he yawned and continued the lazy scratching of his ear. The cat, however, growled angrily to himself for nearly an hour after this encounter. The rabbits and weasels had changed to their white winter coats. A few snow buntings had appeared, and several times they had heard the wild, free, exultant calling of the wild geese, and had looked up to see the long, black V-shaped skeins passing overhead on the long journey southwards. The visitors to the Northlands were leaving, and those who remained were preparing themselves for the long winter that lay ahead. Soon the whole tempo, the very pulse of the north, would bear slower and slower until the snow fell like a soft coverlet. Then, snug and warm beneath, in dens and burrows and hollows, the hibernating animals would sleep, scarcely breathing in their deep unconsciousness until the spring. As though aware of these preparations and their meaning, the three adventurers increased their pace as much as possible within the limits determined by the old dog's strength. On good days they covered as much as 15 miles. Since they had left the Indian encampment on the shores of the Rice Lake, they had not seen any human beings or any sign of human habitation, save once at nightfall when they were nosing around a garbage can outside, a darkened cookhouse of a lumber camp, deep in the very heart of the bush. Marauding bears had been there recently. Their rank, heavy smell still hung in the air, and the cat refused to come nearer, but the old dog, watched by the older, tipped over the heavy can, then tried to pry off the lid with a practiced nose. The can rattled and banged loudly on some rocks, and neither dog heard the sound opening in the dark building behind. Suddenly a blast of shot ripped through the bottom of the can, blowing the lid off and strewing the contents all over the old dog. Deafened and stunned, he stood for a moment, shaking his head. A second gunshot clanged against the metal and brought him to his senses. He grabbed a bone in passing from the plenty strewn all around and dashed after the Labrador, running so fast that he outdistanced him. A spray of gunshot pellets followed, stinging into their hindquarters, so that they leaped simultaneously and redoubled their speed. Soon they were in the shelter of the bush, but it was a long time before they halted for the night. The old dog was so exhausted that he slept until dawn. The pellets had been only momentarily painful, but the incident increased the young dog's wary nervousness. However, a few days later, despite his care, they had another unexpected encounter. They were drinking at midday from a shallow ford crossing an overgrown track to a worked-out silver mine, when a cottontail started up in the bracken across the water. The young dog sprang after, drenching the other two, and they watched the chase, the rabbit's head up, the dog's down, linked in a swerving, leaping rhythm of almost ballet-like precision, until it disappeared among the trees. The terrier shook his coat, spraying the cat again. Furious, the cat stalked off. Alone now, with a brief moment of freedom from the constant daytime urging, the old dog made the most of it. He pottered happily around the lichened rocks and mossy banks, savoring everything with his delicate connoisseur's nose. He flicked the caps of several large fawn mushrooms in some displeasure. A shiny black beetle received his keen attention for a while, and he followed it like a bloodhound. Presently he lost interest and sat on it. He yawned, scratched his ear, then rolled lazily on a patch of dried mud. Suddenly he lay quite still, his paws dangling limply, his head turned back on the ground toward the trail. He freed a crumpled ear to listen more intently. Then his tail registered his pleased anticipation. Someone was walking through the bush toward him. He scrambled to his feet and peered short-sightedly down the trail, his tail curving his hindquarters from side to side in welcome. When an old man carrying a canvas bag appeared, talking quietly to himself, the bull terrier stepped out and awaited him. The old man did not pause. Small and bent, he hobbled quickly past, lifting an ancient green felt hat from a crown of white hair as he went, and nodding to the dog with a brief smile of great sweetness. 2 little gray and white chickadees preceded him, flitting from branch to branch over his head. The old dog fell in contentedly behind. Soon the cat disappeared in the distance, running to catch up, his eyes on the chickadees, and far behind the cat again, his mouth framed around the dangling carcass of a rabbit. Came the triumphant but deeply suspicious Labrador. The straggling procession continued along the cool, green tunnel of the trail for half a mile, until the trees thinned out and they came upon a small cabin and set back in a clearing, within sight of the derelict mine workings. They passed one after another through a small, neatly raked garden, between brown raspberry canes and leafless apple trees, and walked slowly up the steps of the porch. Here the old man set his bag down, knocked on the green door, paused, then opened it, standing courteously aside to motion his followings in before him. The old dog walked in, the cat closely by his shoulder, then the man. The young dog hesitated by the trail's side, his eyes round and distrustful above his burden. Then, apparently reassured by the open door, he carefully laid the rabbit down behind a bush, scratching a layer of leaves over it, and, this done, followed the others. They stood in an expectant ring in the middle of the cabin, savoring a delicious, meaty meal. They watched the old man brush the brim of his hat, hang it on a peg, then hobble over to a small, gleaming wood stove and thrust in another log, washing his hands afterward in a basin filled from a dipper of water. He lifted the lid off a pot simmering on the stove, and the three watchers licked their lips in anticipation. As he took down 4 gold-rimmed plates from a dresser, a chipmunk appeared from behind a blue jug on the top shelf. Chattering excitedly, he ran up the man's arm to his shoulder, where he sat and scolded the strangers with bright, jealous eyes, his little striped body twitching with fury. 2 gleaming lamps appeared in the darkness of the cat's face, and his tail swished in response, but he restrained himself in deference to his surroundings. The old man chided the chipmunk lovingly as he set 4 places at the table, handing it a crust which bulged its cheeks, then ladling 4 very small portions of stew onto the plates. The little animal's nose fell away to the occasional disgruntled squeak, but he ran from shoulder to shoulder to keep watch on the cat. The old dog edged nearer. Looking very small behind a high-backed chair, the old man stood for a moment with his clear, childlike blue eyes closed and his lips moving, then drew out his chair and sat down. He looked around the table, suddenly irresolute. Then his brow cleared, and he rose to draw up the 2 remaining chairs and a bench. "Do sit down," he said. And at the familiar command, the 3 animals behind him sat obediently. He ate slowly and fastidiously. 2 pairs of hypnotized eyes followed every movement of the fork to his mouth. The 3rd pair remained fixed on the chipmunk. Presently the plate was empty, and the old man smiled around the table. But his smile turned again to bewilderment as he saw the 3 untouched plates. He considered them long and thoughtfully, then shrugged his shoulders and moved on to the next. Soon that too came to a confusing end, and sighing, he moved again. Spellbound, his visitors remained rooted to the floor. Even the old dog, for once, was nonplussed. Although he shivered in anticipation and saliva ran down his mouth at the enticing smell, he remained sitting as custom and training decreed. The old man sat on when the last plate was emptied. Lost in his own world, his peaceful stillness diffusing through the little cabin, so that the watchers sat graven in their places. A little wind stirred outside, swinging the door wide open on creaking hinges. A grosbeak flew in to perch on the top, and the mellow fall sunshine slanting on his brilliant plumage. And it seemed as though the living silence of the great forest around surged up and in through the open door with the birds coming, so that the animals stirred uneasily, glancing behind them. The chipmunk's shrill voice cut through the silence, and its claws scrabbled up the dresser as the cat half sprang, but recollected himself in time and slipped out the door after the grosbeak instead. In a sudden awakening, the old man had started to his feet. He looked around as though wondering where he was, his eyes lighting a surprise on the 2 dogs by the door. Slow recognition dawned on his face, and he smiled down affectionately, though the gaze looked thorough and beyond them. "You must come more often," he said, and to the old dog, who stood wagging his tail at the gentle warmth of his voice, "Remember me, your kindly old dear mother?" He escorted the dogs to the door. They filed past him, their tails low and still, then walked slowly and with great dignity down the little winding path between the raspberry canes and the apple trees to the overgrown track. Here they waited for a moment while the young dog furtively uncovered his prize, and the cat joined them. Then, without even looking back, they trotted in close formation out of sight between the trees. A quarter of a mile farther on, the young dog looked carefully around before dropping his rabbit. He nudged it with his nose several times, then turned it over. A moment later, its red-stained fur lay scattered, and both dogs were eating ravenously, growling amicably as they crunched. The cat sat, flexing his claws as he watched. After a while, he rose on his hind legs and stretched his paws to the full extent against a tree, then methodically sharpened their claws on the bark. His head turned sharply, and he paused, for still standing. At a rustle in the long dead grass, a split second later he pounced in a bounding arc. A paw flashed out, pinned down and held, his head bent, and a small squeaking broke off abruptly. Before the dogs were even aware that he had gone, he was back again by his tree, cleaning his whiskers with soft, rounded paws. The following day the travelers came down from the hills to find themselves on the banks of a river running north to south. It was about 100 feet across the far bank, and although shallow enough in the ordinary way, it was far too deep for the animals to cross without swimming. The young dog led the way downstream for some distance, looking for a means of crossing, as it was obvious that his companions would not even wet their feet if they could possibly help it, both sharing a great dislike of water. Once or twice he plunged in and swam around, looking back at the other two, obviously trying to entice them by showing them how easy it was, but they remained sitting close together on the bank, united in misery, and he was forced to continue trotting downstream, becoming increasingly worried as he went, aware that it was the wrong direction. It was lonely, uninhabited country, so that there were no bridges, and the river, if anything, became wider as they trotted along the banks. After 3 or 4 miles, the young dog could endure the frustration no more. He plunged into the water and swam rapidly and strongly across to the other side, his tail streaming out behind like an otter's. He loved the water, and was as much at home in it as the other two hated and feared it. He stood on the far bank, barking encouragingly, but the old dog whined in such distress, the cat yowling in chorus, that he swam across again, paddling around in the shallows near the bank. The old dog walked gingerly into the shallow water, shivering and miserable, turning his head away. Once more the Labrador swam the river, climbed out on the far side, shook himself, and barked. There was no mistaking the command. The old dog took another reluctant step forward, whining piteously, his expressive tail tucked under. The barking continued. Again the terrier advanced. Again the Labrador swam across to encourage him. 3 times he swam across, and the 3rd time the old dog waded in up to his chest and started swimming. He was not a very good swimmer. He swam in jerky, rapid movements, his head held high out of the water, his little black eyes rolling fearfully, but he was a bull terrier, a white cavalier, and he kept on, following the wake of the other, until at last he climbed out on the far side. His transports of joy on reaching dry land were like those of a shipwrecked mariner after 6 weeks at sea on a raft. He rushed in circles, he rolled on his back, he ran along with alternate shoulders low in the long grass to dry himself, until finally he joined the Labrador on the bank to bark encouragingly at the cat. The poor cat now showed the first signs of fear since leaving on his journey. He was alone, and the only way to rejoin his friends lay in swimming across the terrible stretch of water. He ran up and down the bank all the time, keeping up his unearthly Siamese wailing. The young dog went through the same tiring performances that he had used before, swimming to and fro, trying to entice him into the water, but the cat was beside himself with terror, and it was a long while before he finally made up his mind. When he did it, it was with sudden, blind, desperate rush at the water, completely uncat-like. His expression of horror and distance was almost comical. His expression of horror and distaste was almost comical, as he started swimming toward the young dog, who waited for him a few yards out. He proved to be a surprisingly good swimmer, and he was making steady progress across, the dog swimming alongside, when tragedy struck. Many years before, a colony of beaver had dammed a small creek, which had tumbled into the river about 2 miles upstream. Since the beavers had left, the dam had come crumpling and loosening gradually, until it became just a question of time before it would give way altogether and drain the flooded land behind. Now, by a twist of fate, a rotten log gave way and a long section bulged forward under the added strain. Almost as the two animals reached midstream, the dam broke altogether. The pent-up force of the unleashed creek leaped through the gap in an ever-widening torrent, carrying everything before it and surging into the river, where it became a swift, mountainous wave, carrying small trees, torn away branches, pieces of riverbank, and a beaver dam before it on the crest. The young dog saw the onrushing wave several moments before it reached them, and frantically tried to swim into a position upstream of the cat, instinctively trying to protect him, but he was too late, and the great curling crested wave surged over, submerging them in a whirlwind of chaos and debris. The end of a log struck the cat full on the head, and he was swept under and over until his body was finally caught on a half-submerged piece of the old dam, and he was carried along at the impetus of the wave as it tore down the river bed. The old dog, barking in anxiety, for he had sensed the disaster although he could not see it, waded chest-deep in the churning water, but its force knocked him back again. Breathless and choking, he was forced to retreat. The other dog, strong swimmer though he was, made his way to the bank only with the greatest difficulty. Even then he was carried almost half a mile downstream before his feet were on the firm ground. Immediately he set off downstream in pursuit. Several times he saw the little figure of the cat, half under the water, surging ahead on the swift white crest, but he was never near enough, except at one point where the partially submerged piece of beaver dam caught on an overhanging branch. He plunged in immediately, but just as he was nearly within reach, it tore free, and once more went whirling down the river until it was lost to sight. Gradually the dog fell farther and farther behind. At last he was brought to a complete halt when the river entered a rocky gorge, with no foothold on either side. He was forced to climb inland, and by the time he rejoined the river bank on the far side of the gorge, there was no sign of the cat. It was nearly dark when he returned to find the terrier, who was walking wearily toward him along the river bank. The Labrador was exhausted, limping, and utterly spent and miserable. So much so that he barely returned the greeting of the bewildered and lonely old dog, but dropped to the ground, his flanks heaving, and lay there until thirst drove him to the water's edge. They spent that night where they were, by the bank of the river, peaceful at last after the violence of the afternoon. They laid curled closely together for comfort and warmth, and when a thin, cold rain fell as the wind rose, they moved together under the spreading branches of an old spruce for shelter. In the middle of the night, the old dog sat up, trembling all over with cold. He threw his head back and howled in requiem of grief and loneliness to the heavy weeping sky, until at last the young dog rose wearily and led him away from the river, long before dawn broke and over the hills to the west.